Hi, Misha here, and this is part 5, looking at the Starfleet. Part 1, we looked at pre-warp and early warp, pre-Federation vessels, right up to the founding of the Federation. Part 2, we looked at the first century, a little bit more, of the Federation from the initial Daedalus class through the Constitution, and the Constitution refits, and the Constellation. And then in part 3, we began with the Excelsior, and ran through the Golden Age, the first one at least, and the Galaxy and its derivatives. But then we have a hard stop when we run up against the Battle of Wolf 359 there. And then in part 4, we looked at the Warriors, essentially. Interactions with the Borg, Dominion, even some rising tensions with Romulans. So now in part 5, we kind of collect the oddballs a bit. We more or less ended with the beginning of the 25th century. We're going to look at vessels that served in the 25th, but then we're going to have some time jumps all the way to the 32nd century. So this video is going to cover the longest interval of time, even though it'll probably be one of the shorter episodes. And it's a bit of a catch-all video too. Now, I decided not to do shuttles and space stations, just focusing on starships. So any single seat or an even 2-seat spacecraft, not for this video. We need something that at least holds a few crew and is at least a couple of dozen meters long. So yeah, if you haven't checked out the first 4 episodes, you might like to. And as I said in episode 1, after this I'll probably do one big supercut of all these videos. So let's dive on in. We begin with the last of the Galaxy classes. The Galaxy refit. Originally the Galaxy was considered a heavy cruiser, a deep space exploration vehicle. The refit, though, was considered a battle cruiser or dreadnought. Now these were not newly constructed. They were refits of existing Galaxy hulls because considerable time and effort went into building these large vessels. And this actually is the second update. The first came during the Dominion War, known as the Venture refit, or the Venture class. It added additional phaser strips, most notably on top of the nacelles, and more durable hull armor and shielding. It, generally speaking, refocused the ship from science and exploration and keeping families on board to combat, patrol, research, reconnaissance, and keeping troops on board. After that, of course, those again, like I said, were built in the 2370s. The Dreadnought version came in 2394 or thereabouts, and added a third nacelle. This was not capable of quantum slipstream, modern transwarp, because of the hull design, but it was able to get up to about warp 9.8 old scale. So that's one improvement. Another is the rather massive power of the Galaxy was utilized, and a phaser lance was installed under the saucer. And because of its positioning, the original torpedo launcher was replaced with 2 high-velocity, rapid-speed photon launchers. It was not capable of doing quantum torpedoes, it was just too old for that, but it could have a lot of photons coming out. Looking at the top, 2 phaser cannon were mounted on pivots, as well as additional sensors added behind the bridge module. Not a ton of these were built because not many Galaxy classes survived into the 2390s that were worth refitting, but it was seen occasionally into the early 25th century and again kind of refocused using the large size and energy power plant of the vessel. After all these updates, it was no longer capable of saucer separation, something that was found less than useful anyway. But with the end of the original Galaxy class, a replacement would be sought. After those Galaxy class space rams that could be updated were, after that was over, work began on a replacement. The Sovereign and Odyssey were very capable vessels, and the Odyssey definitely had a lot of exploration potential, but still the old Galaxy had a lot of space inside, a lot of flexibility. It was a very modular system. Thus, in the late 24th century, design work began, and around the dawn of the 25th, the Andromeda class launched, with USS Andromeda being the class type. Very much based on the Galaxy, but updated and made more capable based on lessons learned from before. After all, while things were better than they had been during the Dominion War era, nevertheless, the Golden Age was long over, and the Andromeda does show that. This vessel is a little bit longer than a Galaxy at about 695 meters, so roughly 50 meters longer, with more room in the star drive here. Although its standard crew is slightly smaller at about 850. Of course, it can house many more than that. That's mostly thanks to automation. While it was designed as a traditional multi-role cruiser and deep space exploration vessel, some had criticized even the Odyssey for still too much involved in battle. There was also an effort to really put the most modern cutting-edge technology. For example, there's a large sensor palette in the back that can be used for science, of course, but also in a combat role, reconnaissance, espionage. And more thought was given to the tactical systems of the Andromeda: stronger shields, better hull armor. And unlike the Galaxy, since this is a next generation vessel, it was capable of both standard warp and quantum slipstream. Otherwise, it has standard armaments for the era: torpedoes, phasers, and of course it carries shuttles. So it could be called into use as a combat cruiser, acting as a heavy cruiser, even battle cruiser. But it was built with hopes that it could be a deep space explorer in the vein of many famous classes before. It was also one of the first ships to support a new style of nacelle and deflector, which would appear on several subsequent classes, pushing the technology forward. And we will still see a divide between San Francisco shipyards and Utopia Planitia and others. So sometimes there are overlapping roles, and there is a kind of a push in Starfleet between combat, exploration, engineering, different eras. Conflicts would flare up, but also be put down rather quickly in a year or two. So there's a bit of a swing back and forth between. But yeah, the Andromeda class was the official replacement for the Galaxy for the 25th century here. After Voyager's return, Lieutenant Commander Barclay, working at the Pathfinder project, got really drunk on Romulan ale, went to the holodeck, and used MS Paint to add a lot of guns and torpedo launchers to the Intrepid class. If only Janeway had had those, she would have used them. In the 2370s, the Intrepid was a very advanced ship, but of course by the 2390s, it was aging. But the Voyager brought a lot of technology back, and other expeditions had it well. And by this point, quantum slipstream drive is into the fleet. So it only seems fitting that the Intrepid design would be revisited and updated with the new technology, resulting in the Pathfinder class, with the pilot ship being the USS Pathfinder. Like the Andromeda, this was not created primarily for war. This was considered a long-range science vessel, not exactly an explorer in and of itself, more of a research science vessel. And in fact, hopes were that this vessel, along with a smaller fleet, could trace back to the Delta Quadrant, and going at slipstream velocities, it'd only take a few months, not decades. And you can see the changes made. First off, this is slightly longer at about 380 meters and has a slightly larger crew than the Intrepid at about 200. It has underslung nacelles, somewhat borrowed from the Dauntless, and also a deflector dish, at least a primary, and a concave underbelly to the saucer, also borrowed from the Dauntless, and it still has a secondary deflector in the front, but enlarged. This was specifically designed for long duration quantum slipstream travel. The Federation Dauntless and the Federation Vesta classes pushed slipstream into full production. This made it dependable. And of course, it was named after the Pathfinder program from the 2370s and became a very popular, very fast vessel. And it was also reasonably well armed and armored, but geared more towards defense than offense. It could still hold its own. And this would let the original Intrepid design be retired. And yeah, just part of that new 25th century fleet, seen here and there throughout the Federation. Well, the Andromeda and the Pathfinder really were Starfleet trying to get back to exploration and science. But we also have to face the realities of space at the beginning of the 25th century, the destabilization of various elements. And it was about time that some of the smaller ships, the escort ships like the Sabre, even the original Defiant, would get replaced. Thus we get the Shran class, named after the Andorian admiral. This was considered a pilot escort vessel. Small and compact, very energy efficient, very maneuverable. It's about 220 meters long, a crew of 95 to 100. Good weapons and shielding for its size. It was designed for easy mass production to replace losses Starfleet might have. And it was also designed to kind of work in a small fleet of 2, 4, 6, or even greater numbers. As the name would suggest, it would escort freighters, civilian craft, even science vessels, kind of working more on the edges of Federation space, defending against pirates, raiders, unknown factions, rogue elements, essentially a police craft or a Coast Guard cutter in space. And since space is large, even with quantum slipstream technology, you want to be able to mass produce these. Whereas like the Andromeda, well, it's so large you're not going to make tons of them. And the Pathfinder, it's so complicated and advanced, you're not going to make a lot of these. There's not a lot of new technology here. It's just tried and true. A bit of the Defiant, a bit of the Dauntless. And for this era, it's a pretty Spartan lifestyle inside. But then again, these aren't sent out on year-long missions. They're usually sent out for weeks, maybe a couple of months patrol, and then report back to Starbase. And some of them were just simply attached to Starbases for short-range patrol missions, essentially acting like a large fighter. But it's science and exploration abilities were limited. So the next step up would be the Edison class light cruiser. This is about 360 meters long overall. Operates with a crew of 300 to 350. And is just kind of the middle of the road. Think of something to replace the Miranda or the Centaur, larger patrol craft. It's quite flat. It uses a nacelle variant, somewhat based on the Andromedas, but kind of squashed in. Yeah, this is just in between, designed for relatively good mass production and for months-long missions rather than weeks. We're not really capable of really deep space patrols. Now, this is a gopher vessel. It can work as a resupply ship, a response ship. Generally speaking, just a workaday patrol ship doing whatever the Federation needs to do. So a medium-size, medium-class, multi-role vessel. And by the 25th century, these are quite apparent and would be used both in peacetime and wartime. Of course, they have quantum slipstream, the usual quantum torpedoes, phasers. Nothing really revolutionary here, but it allowed some of the older mid-range vessels to get replaced. And from there, our next step up, we've looked at some designs from Utopia Planitia. Now let's check in with what the San Francisco yards were up to. In 2399, the Gagarin class first took to the stars and was in full service by 2401. This is classed as a medium cruiser or battle cruiser in combat situations. It's about 490 meters long, crew of 550, quantum slipstream drive, has an interesting forked nacelle system, trying to get the benefits of a quad system and also the benefits of a dual system. Very flat design. This was also a pretty multi-role vessel, like the Edison class, but more capable in either deep space exploration, patrol, long range, science observation missions, or, yes, combat missions. And these would be quite common in the fleet. Again, alternative system built by San Francisco instead of Utopia Planitia. Still, technologically speaking, about the same level, but a different design, and in some ways a more conventional looking design overall. And really, that's one of the last of these vessels built during a time of more or less peace. As the 25th century rolled on, tensions would start to rise here, there, and everywhere. And of course, Starfleet's security was greatly compromised by a Borg infestation. And this would spark a new series of vessels. Based on a vessel already geared towards tactical operations, the Inquiry class, we have the Avenger class. This is an interesting vessel because it's really too large to be an escort, but it's also too small to be a full-size cruiser, especially with its capabilities, good and bad. So it fits somewhere in between. One might consider it a tactical cruiser. Size-wise, it's about the same as the Inquiry, about 550 meters, a crew of 500. However, it was designed to engage multiple smaller vessels in combat, namely at the time the Klingons. Political winds had changed in the Empire, So it was designed to be very fast, offensively oriented, capable of targeting and combating multiple smaller foes at a time, as well as running interference protection for convoys. The trade-off was that it had somewhat weaker hull armor and integrity. This is what it gave up. So it mostly relied on its shields. So if those failed, it was quite open to attack. But there and again, it was quick and nimble, so the best way really is just not to get hit at all. And this allowed it to function like a very large escort. And it shows the continuation of the Inquiry class, which had been very popular in the 2390s and then had been somewhat retrofitted in the early 25th century. This is the next step forward that happened after the Borg infestation, and then that would lead to distrust amongst the Klingons. And of course, eventually 8472 would reappear and other events. This fulfilling the tactical role, rapid response force, and what have you. After the Klingons would respond themselves to the Avenger, the next step would come in 2405, with a design team headed by Engineering Commander Nog. We would get the Chimera class, and this has an interesting designation. It's designated as a heavy destroyer. And typically, destroyers are rather small craft. And while this one is not huge, it's not small. At about 450 meters, and a crew of really about the same, 450. This was kind of based on the Avengers' general idea, but more emphasis was put on defense and regenerating the shielding. But it was still designed to engage multiple targets, and it was meant to be able to take on not only birds of prey, but also large cruisers like the Negvar, Vorja, and more advanced Klingon cruisers. It had quite advanced engineering systems, which would somewhat limit its mass production during tense times. It was quite effective, and it could take on 3 or 4 ships by itself, so it was a good force multiplier, thanks to more advanced targeting systems and, of course, weaponry. But it would really just start an arms race. The Klingons would respond with the Moog class, which we talked about in the Klingon video I did some time ago. So we start to see a bit of one-upsmanship here. But this was a very capable vessel, and the original USS Chimera would be commanded by Captain Nog, who was promoted after the successful development of this class at Mars. So it was successful, insofar as it goes. So we're seeing some fleets form, and now we need centralized command and control vessels. Returning to a true quad nacelle design, we have what might be considered an up-sized Edison class, at least built on similar technology, the Buran class. This was designed as a medium deep space cruiser, but in a combat tactical situation, it could also function as a localized command cruiser. Not huge, not small, about 460 meters long, and it had a crew of roughly 500. So solidly in the medium cruiser class, but with a little more thought given to long-range missions and centralized command and control. Something like a constellation before it. We see quad nacelle ships appear on and off throughout all of Starfleet history. Yeah, a size up that could coordinate smaller vessels like the Shran class, even the Avenger and Chimera. Not quite as laser focused in on offensive combat. This was again a bit more of a well-rounded vessel. And for various reasons, Starfleet just likes having quad nacelle designs. So this was the one introduced in the late first decade of the 25th century. Interestingly, it has its bridge mounted towards the front of the saucer and a bit of an axe head look to it. Somewhat unique profile and design. The ships had an interesting reputation as well. So we go from a bit of a general purpose, multi-purpose quad nacelle to a very specific one. The Europa class command and control cruiser tactical command ship. These were specifically built to operate as fleet flagships command outposts. And so they were actually intentionally made rather compacted with heavy hull plating and very rigid shielding. They're only about 420 meters long, but because they're intended to have admirals and their staff on board, as well as, strategic planners and coordinators, they had a crew of 550, large for their small enough size. While they had offensive capabilities, of course, they weren't really meant to be in the thick of it. Again, they were meant to coordinate. And they never planned on mass producing these. It was always meant to be a limited production vessel, just building a couple of dozen to command sector fleets and maybe planetary defenses. And it was given 4 nacelles for both redundancy and so it could get from point A to point B quickly if needed. So a bit of a take on the Baran type, but more specialized. And you can see definitely a lineage similarity here. And this is one of the more combat-oriented tactical vessels produced before the year 2410. By this point, tensions with the Klingons are starting to simmer down, but other tensions from external threats are coming up. And also the Romulans make trouble now and again, even though they've lost their homeworld. The Tal Shiar, the Imperial seat, continue to give issues. And as I mentioned, there are concerns about Species 8472 infiltrating various houses in the Klingon Empire, as well as Admiralty of Starfleet. But after a few years of just designing warships and kind of replenishing fleet losses, kind of nibbled to death by piranhas here and there, the idea of science exploration was still, there was always a big group in Starfleet that advocated for this. Your traditionalists, your dreamers. And an opportunity came with the Odyssey class. This was fielded well before 2400. Like I said in the previous video, it was 1,000 meters long, large crew, science combat oriented. In some ways it combined the Galaxy and Sovereign. But they did not make many of these. Again, like a lot of the heavy cruisers, dreadnoughts, battleships, there's just not the resources for it. And of course, it's kind of the old adage of eggs in one basket. Speaking of, during one of the Klingon conflicts, the USS Yorktown, an Odyssey class, was wrecked very severely. And while the hulk was salvaged, it either was going to have to be scrapped or have a major refit rebuild. And that's the course that was decided upon. Since so many new parts, components were needed anyway, the Odyssey refit was born, known as the Yorktown class. because, well, the Yorktown was the first to receive the updates. While some were geared towards stronger shields, more rigidity, a little bit better speed, the next generation in quantum slipstream technology, a great emphasis was put on science and research. So they really focused on improving the sensors and other technology, as well as just modular packages for scientific missions. So while this is still classified as a dreadnought, even battleship if needed, when they had the chance, when they had to refit it, they tried to improve its scientific capabilities. The good news is, even though you have a ship that's dedicated to science, it could easily defend itself, unlike older science ships like the Oberth. So, science with a gun, if you will. After the Yorktown was updated and put back into service, the USS Enterprise NCC 1701F received the same treatment. And a few others would be either newly built or updated as well. Never a very common vessel. There was only about a dozen in the fleet. But the Yorktown class, the Odyssey refit, does show that this commitment to science was far from abandoned, even after quite a few years of hardship. And built with much of the same technology pioneered on the ships we've looked at, is an all-new class. Not really based on anything, just something new. The Concorde class. This is considered a heavy cruiser or battle cruiser. And while it is fully combat capable, it's really designed more as a fleet support ship, centralized for resupply, assistance, rescue missions, that kind of thing. So it has a pretty good engineering department, kind of like the next generation after the Parliament class, which itself was a specialized replacement for the California class. It also has a resemblance to the Excelsior, to my mind, although the nacelles are somewhat derived from the Chimera. And it does have a reasonably well-armored hull. This is a larger scale vessel, a crew of 750 and well over 600 meters long. Not quite as large internally as a Galaxy or Andromeda. Kind of commensurate to the Sovereign in a lot of ways, and a very good complement to the Odyssey. But this would serve as a fleet command ship, whereas the Europa would command local sectors, individual squadrons, more in a tactical role. This would command an entire quadrant, entire group, if it was called on for a combat situation. If it were peacetime, which they were hoping for, it would simply be a central coordination ship, a localized flagship, if not the flagship for the entire fleet, for again the entire region. At this point, Starfleet is spreading out. They had long since outgrown the Alpha Quadrant, going into the Beta, now the Gamma, and even the Delta. So while they're not spanning the entire galaxy yet, they're further apart than before. So you need a place where decisions can be made without going all the way back to Starfleet Command to San Francisco. So this vessel could serve. Whereas the Odyssey was specialized for science and exploration, going into the middle of nowhere, the Concorde would stay more in populated areas, more in high traffic systems, serving a little bit of a different role. But again, it was still a very capable vessel, about the same size and capacity as a Sovereign, and spiritually speaking, a very good replacement to the good old venerable Excelsior. And that is the frontline fleet as of 2410. Although, there are a couple more worth mentioning from this era. We don't have many support ships from this era to talk about, but one is the replacement for the venerable Antares class. One of the prototypes for this tanker, freighter, supply tender would be misappropriated by Section 31 and Admiral Doherty in 2375 and transformed into a large holodeck to illegally abduct several hundred natives of a planet. However, that vessel, while its specific configuration was unique, was just a new liner from this era, meant to transport ore, freight, cargo, refined goods, and yes, passengers. Normally it could easily transport 1,000 or more. Essentially, it was a barge in space. It had integrated nacelles and a command structure in the front, and was only lightly defended with phasers and had reasonable shields. But this would be the major bulk vessel well into the 25th century. We're talking about something that was over 600 meters long, able to transport thousands of tons and go for rather long-range missions. So when war wasn't preventing it, vessels similar to this would be traveling throughout the Alpha, Beta, and later Gamma and Delta quadrants, doing trade, some owned by the Federation, Starfleet, some owned by independent traders as time would go on. And this would be the new Antares class for the 25th century. And speaking of moving forward in the century, by 2410, relations with the Klingon Empire were again improving. To be fair, it wasn't always the Klingons inciting distrust and violence. After all, Section 31 is a thing. The Federation has made some poor judgment calls as well. But bygones are made bygones, and the two races that often act like siblings put their squabbles aside and united, not only in a common defense and common cause against external threats, but even in a common design. Named for the Khitomer Accords from over a century earlier, which initially established peace between the Federation and Klingon Empire, the Khitomer class, first fielded in 2411, was a true joint project between Starfleet and the Klingon Defense Force, with clearly recognizable elements from both design aesthetics. Heck, there was even some Romulan influence. Even some Romulan officers served on board these. The initial Khitomer would be followed over the years by 9 sister ships. And this was really to unify the Alpha Quadrant and Beta in common defense as they pushed deeper into our galaxy and faced threats, even interdimensional. And it was a technological improvement when all the major races combined efforts. Well, things happened. This isn't a huge ship. It's about 760 meters long and has a crew of roughly 700. So not tiny at all, but of course it's capable of quantum slipstream. It has a cloaking device. It has next generation shielding, more advanced shielding than before. It also has improved hull armor with energy displacement. It has an improved deflector system. And really, its biggest improvement is just the cooperation and combining experiences, lessons learned by the three major races, plus some minor influence by even the Cardassians and Ferengi. But it was to give a unified defense line and command ship for the Allied cause. And really would usher in a new generation of cooperation and peace, and would issue in, finally, the Klingons officially joining the Federation years later. Before that, they'd been allies on and off, but in the 25th century, they would actually become a member nation, a member planet, as would many others. So with that, we're going to take our first leap into the future, skipping forward about a century, to talk about a very ambitious project in what some might consider the second golden age. In celebration for the Khitomer Alliance, which would lead to the Klingons joining the Federation and the Romulans and Vulcans healing their long separation, the Universe Project was started in the early 26th century. But it would take half of that century to come to fruition, because this was ambition on a scale really never seen in the galaxy before. The idea was to take the latest in slipstream transwarp technology and try transiting the void to nearby galaxies, with Andromeda being the first effort, a journey which would have taken thousands of years at old-scale warp, even hundreds of years at constant high-speed warp, and still several years at slipstream. And the thing is, in between the galaxies, there's not much there. There's no layovers, there's no stopping places. So even with the newest technology, the vessel would have to be extremely self-sufficient. Not a city in space, but an entire nation state in space. Finally, in 2550, the USS Universe was tested, quickly joined by the USS Enterprise NCC 1701J, and sent out on its mission. This was considered a deep space explorer dreadnought, and while it had battle capabilities for sure, at this time the galaxy is quite quiet. Of course, there are always other threats popping up here and there, interdimensional, intergalactic, and soon, even other things. But for now, the second golden age is in full swing, and the Universe Project is at the fore. This vessel is at a scale to rival a Borg cube, at 3,600 meters long, 2 miles. It is thin, but still it has many, many decks. And it was created with an interesting process. This was one of the first designs to feature some artificial, partially organic construction and material. Although, the roots of it do date back to the Intrepid class and the bioneural circuitry. What they would do, they would replicate essentially seeds with construction orders, and then those seeds, those replicated seeds, would grow and more or less self-assemble, although some assembly was still required by regular organics, regular humanoids, and it would take quite some time to grow this vessel. Quantum slipstream technology, the latest in phaser technology, particle beams, transphasic torpedoes. But because of the size and the long, not just a 5-year mission or whatever, but decades mission, everything that could be needed was on board. First off, there was not a centralized command area. Rather, it was separated more like office buildings throughout, different areas controlling different things, with a centralized artificial intelligence kind of commanding the whole ship. Of course, you have standard crew quarters, but you have full-size parks on board, artificial parks. Of course, you have the best in holodecks. There were also university structures, not just classrooms as featured on the Galaxy class, but actual full schools, universities on board. There's full recreation facilities, not just theaters and cinemas, but actual production facilities to make new shows and entertainment for the crew. Again, everything you'd need. Hard to estimate the crew of this vessel, but easily multiple thousands, 5,000, 10,000, quite variable. How many were required to operate it? Honestly, not that many, because it was quite self-sufficient and, again, partially organic and had an artificial intelligence controlling it. It would be interesting to hear the stories of these vessels. Obviously, not a ton were sent out, but in homage to the original Constitution, 12 were sent different directions. A couple were kept in the Milky Way galaxy for home use, but the others were sent to the nearby galaxies to see what was seeable. Again, though, with even the 26th century technology, they were a long ways off. And they were crewed by humans and Vulcans and Romulans and Klingons and Cardassians and Ferengi and Bajorans and Xindi and all besides. Intermixing and breeding and really forming the ideal utopian future that had been dreamt of since the founding of the Federation in 2161. Finally the ideal, after hundreds of years, was perhaps in reach. And the Universe class was what was designed to finally conquer the final frontier of space. But now we move not 1 century, but 3 centuries into the future to find the next final frontier. Time. The new frontier of the 29th century was time. As the Federation expanded and explored throughout the galaxy, and as conventional drives improved more and more, time became a thing. And once you master time, distance becomes more or less irrelevant. Yes, you can go forward, past, to the future, but you can also essentially go as far as you want into the universe and negate the ravages on your body. And it got to the point where a lot of people were able to travel without vessels themselves, even just small devices. But ships did exist. Some were single-seat craft, like the Aeon. But there were police vessels, time temporal enforcement vessels, like the USS Relativity of the Wells class. This is yet more organic technology, more blending of Klingon and human and Romulan and Vulcan aesthetics. This is a much smaller vessel, though, at under 200 meters, with a crew of roughly 250, although it could operate with just a few. It was charged with monitoring the time stream, multiple time streams even, and correcting any incursions, and it was specifically designed to not fracture time. And it was a fully capable vessel. It was armed with an advanced molecular disruptor weapon, as well as advanced torpedoes. They could literally break things apart at the molecular level, essentially erasing them from time. Not unlike some of the equipment we saw used by the Krenim in the 24th century. Again, once you take time out of it, aging has no meaning. That's why these vessels, the Wells classes, served for well over 200 years, from the early 29th century to the mid 31st century. But ultimately, this golden age would come to an end. Like Icarus, perhaps they flew a little too high and a little too close. While the Federation, was using time travel responsibly, other races were not. And again, once you open up the time travel, anyone from any point in time can intervene. This would lead to the temporal Cold War, which could have been a huge crisis. And it nearly was. However, at the last minute, temporal agents were able to divert it and stop it, and thus an order went down in roughly 3050 to dismantle the great time machines, the great engines of propelling mind and body through the cosmos, so that this technology could not fall into the wrong hands again. Really not since the advent of nuclear explosions, nuclear weapons, had something so devastating been unleashed. And once that genie's out of the bottle, that's often it. But narrowly, this crisis was diverted. So vessels like the USS Relativity were retired. But Starfleet would continue on. Not exactly in a dark age, but let's say an age of backing off from technology and reflection, at least a bit. So with that, let's jump forward again and look at the Starfleet and the next millennium. As the temporal Cold War ended at the beginning of the third millennium, ships had to be reevaluated. The Wells class was meant to be a temporal police ship, but several other larger vessels were in service, but would have their temporal abilities removed. So, in this new 31st century, we see a new design aesthetic and new technologies with gaps and detached surfaces held together by subspace items, entities, matter, and force fields. This is done for safety, it's done for maneuverability, flexibility, ease, and also defense, almost like phasing out parts of the vessel that are critical. And of course, the internal technologies are much more advanced. Personal transporters, true AI, adaptable systems, programmable matter. Just because the temporal aspects needed to be removed doesn't mean that the future aspects did not as well. So this is not the end. This is not the beginning of a dark age, but it's a reevaluation and stepping back a little bit from technology. So to begin with, we have a medium cruiser of the era, the Intrepid class, the USS Voyager J, at about 460 meters long. This is a bit of a rapid response vessel, able to get there quickly, provide adequate support, and it's a bit of a retro throwback design. It very clearly has nacelles and a star drive and a saucer, but not only are the nacelles detached, the star drive and saucer are as well, and it has the very angular look. These were produced in quite large numbers and were very much the mainstay of Starfleet in this period. They had standard weapons and could travel at high warp or quantum slipstream, although since time travel had been the name of the game for several centuries, their more conventional FTL systems were perhaps a bit atrophied, or at least stagnant. Makes sense though, it's not technology they really had to worry about for a minute there. Time travel allowed different types of getting through space. But Starfleet's going strong, and with the Intrepid class, it's them looking back to the past and reminding themselves to persevere. And it's one of the most iconic ships of this generation. We don't know exactly when this class was introduced, but it served for decades, probably alongside the Wells. As I said though, this was a medium member. Centuries ago, a vessel of this size would actually be considered a heavy cruiser, but by the 31st century, this is considered a light cruiser, even a scout escort vessel, the Mars class. This was used for patrol, rapid response, police actions, defense, and is just over 400 meters long. But it has oversized, detached nacelles of a newer pattern, trying to squeeze every little bit out of it they can. And for its size, it's well appointed for defense. Doesn't have a lot of internal volume for crew and cargo, but enough for its needs. And these are made in very large numbers and would serve for decades in the fleet. Perhaps this was the next step up from the Wells. As I mentioned earlier, it was around 200 meters, so this is larger than it. This might have been the next version from there. We don't really know much about this in terms of specifications. For that matter, that could be said for all of these 31st century Starfleet vessels. But they all seem to be built with similar technology, although there are many variations, including full habitat modules, artificial environments that can travel through space. So it's a very diverse fleet. And while these two, especially the Intrepid, do resemble traditional human Starfleet, you can tell that there's a lot of influences from other races as you get deeper in. For example, the Eisenberg class. A much less conventional design. Still featuring detached nacelles though. This is also a much larger scale. It's over 1,200 meters long, although a good chunk of that is the large spike protruding from the back, which is presumably part of the engine system. This would seem to be a vessel dedicated towards trade, maybe transport, but it certainly has weapons as well. It's not an unarmed civilian. This is still a Starfleet ship, just a less aggressive version. In fact, ships of this era, while there are challenges in the galaxy, aren't combat vessels as such. You can tell that this was an era of still more or less peace after the Temple Cold War. And this would seem to indicate that quite strongly. This, of course, is the USS Nog, named after the Ferengi captain who designed the Chimera, the first Ferengi in Starfleet for that matter. Again, it's showing Starfleet looking towards the past, so there's a bit of nostalgia drifting in. Maybe the attraction of days gone by, days of yore. Makes sense at this point. The Federation is coming up on being 1,000 years old, so good time for reflection. And they may feel like their job is done. After all, they've more or less unified the galaxy. It's peaceful. Society's utopian. It's true. Post-scarcity. Replicators are everywhere, personal transporters. Anyone can go anywhere in the galaxy in a matter of weeks, even days. Species have married and intermingled, and even the Vulcans and Romulans are still getting on. For the most part, even the Cardassians and Bajorans seem to have put their differences aside. It took centuries, but they did. And the Ferengi, well, they're still Ferengi, but little more honorable. And the Eisenberg class shows that, different roles. And while most of the ships in the fleet have this detached nacelle system, not all do. For example, the Courage class. This is nearly as long as the Eisenberg at over 1100 meters, but actually has more volume because of its hull layout. In the olden days, this ship might have been considered a deep space, long-range, long-endurance explorer, although at this era, there's not much left to explore. Maybe move you up just a bit. It's a tall one. So not only is it quite long, it's quite tall. So it's one of the larger vessels in the fleet, although not the largest. This could also be used and was used as a command post, a mobile base, center of operations, coordination, and it definitely could be used to evacuate an area if needs be. Its evacuation capacity was quite impressive, several thousands. But it's just yet another one of the more unique designs. It has what appears a saucer, but then everything else is quite different. And it's interesting to see a more or less a vertically oriented vessel, kind of this diamond shape on one end. And even though there are no detached nacelles, it's very clear this is built from future technology and unknown components. It's hard to identify things like bridges, impulse manifolds, things like that, but they've long since moved past it. So the fleet is quite strong. Starfleet, if maybe a bit indulgent and a bit over, the era of exploration and kind of trying to find a purpose for itself, is still doing quite well. That is until the burn happened. In the year 3069, all dilithium crystals across the galaxy formed a resonation that resulted in an explosion if they were in a FTL core subject to energy retention and transmission. So basically any active dilithium crystals in a core exploded. This instantaneously wiped out a good chunk of Starfleet and a great number of ships in the Federation and a number of ships throughout the galaxy. Although, to be fair, not all ships use dilithium. For example, Romulans use forced singularity. This would be the end of the second Golden Age, or at least Silver Age, and would plunge the galaxy into a true Dark Age. A Dark Age that would last for over 100 years. Think about it. Remove FTL. That is the key to any interstellar, intergalactic civilization, being able to go to other systems. Take that away and you're back to generational ships, or being stuck on singular planets. Take trade away. Not everything's made on every planet. Things eventually break down and wear out. People are scared. People die. Even famines can happen. Technology wasn't entirely lost, of course, and not all of Starfleet was destroyed. Several dozens, even hundreds of ships did survive for various reasons, including the Voyager J. but Starfleet went from being the dominant power in at least this part of the galaxy to a minor entity, even a mythological one. And most importantly, Starfleet went from a position of extreme confidence to, frankly, timidness, being scared, being reclusive. And that's what happened from 3070 all the way until the year 3189. That would be the year the USS Discovery shot from the 23rd century into the 32nd. Even though time travel had been outlawed, I guess no one told them. And it was an old ship, of course, although new. For that time and era, it was a new ship in the fleet, so it didn't have a lot of light years on the hull. And this is actually where we see another cool technology from this era. Miniature molecular molecules that could be reprogrammed into anything, and they can take existing matter they find and restructure it at the molecular level into anything. So, true replicators. So using the Crossfield class hull as a base, it was rewritten into a modern Starfleet design. Detached nacelles, a new hull structure, updated shielding, more or less modern deflector system, even to some extent modernized weaponry. Again, when you can rewrite any matter into anything, it can be as simple as making your favorite chair fit you better, or making your pillow better, to rebuilding an entire starship in a matter of weeks. So it wasn't instantaneous. Essentially, it was a combination of Borg assimilation, if you think about it, but in a non-invasive way. That allowed the Crossfield to serve as a rapid response, scout, and defense vehicle. It's still 500 meters long, which was massive for its era, but actually makes it quite small for this time. And it would cap off our 32nd century Starfleet, serving in the evacuation of Earth in 3190, at least, in the whole effort, and serving presumably into the next century. And they worked out a solution to the burn issue, which slowly but surely restored FTL capability, safe travel, rather, in the galaxy, and we see the reemergence and the rebuilding of Starfleet, and the Federation regaining much that was lost. It had degraded down to just a couple of dozen members, but it started to add back. And that's where we leave it. That's as far into the future as we have seen Starfleet so far. But consider we're at 1,000 years plus after the initial founding of the United Federation of Planets. So it did endure many trials, many wars, many tribulations, many natural disasters like the burn. It endured. And thus we end this part of the video. And now it's time to switch over to the other half, where I talk real world and my impressions of these designs. Although this is one of the shorter parts in our series. But anyway, with that, let's dive into the other part. Let's begin with and get this one out of the way, the holo ship. I don't think insurrection is the worst thing ever, but I think it's no one's favorite film, and arguably the worst of the Next Generation films. Hard to say, it or Nemesis, but I personally enjoyed Nemesis a little more. Again, not irredeemably bad, just yeah. This ship was in it. It needs to be included, but I also will say this suffers. This is from Eaglemoss. It's a good size, but they did something very odd here. It's plastic and hollow. I can't think of any other time they did this. There's actually a small amount of metal, like inside here. It's just an odd one for them that they went so plasticky. And then when we looked at the Zoza, they did a really good job with it. I think they were trying to get the detail in, but yeah. Fun fact, originally, this was actually meant to be the rear with this kind of overlooking the front, kind of like the Grimal Cardassian. Anyway, it's a thing. No one's favorite, but they need to put it in somewhere because it's a Federation ship design. Though our next one, a little less so. This is one of the, I guess this was the last quote-unquote Klingon ship that was done in the Star Trek Online collection. It very clearly is a video game ship. Maybe I'm wrong, but I can't see this being in a show. But it is that kind of weird video game unique thing you'll see. It's fine. I think it looks the way it looks. I think it was meant to look this. It is definitely a smashed together. It kind of reminds me of the Jaeger, if I'm being honest. You know, the Intrepid and Maquis Raider mashed together. Except here you've got Federation nacelles and a cutback saucer meshed together with what looks like a Klingon hull. It's actually a little bit lighter than the other Klingon ships in this series, but then again, the online series tends to be just a little bit larger than the standard, and then it is a good size. In the standard series, this would be one of the biggest ships, but it's a little bit lighter because of its shape. Also, the metal is up front. It's got a little bit of plastic here and there, but this is metal on the sides too. It's nice. It's not my favorite, but it's one of those weird, unique ships that I bet will end up kind of being semi-collectible. In fact, in general, even though the Star Trek Online collection was only 20 issues and was canceled, sales weren't great. Now that Master Replicas is selling Eaglemoss stock, they say that their Star Trek Online ships, especially the Federation ones, Starfleet ones, are really their best sellers. I think a lot of people passed up buying these, and now that they realize it's a limited chance and they probably ever won't be reprinted, it's just unique to get ships from a video game, frankly. Really unique. Yeah, it's cool for what it is, but it's not a favorite, but I'm really happy we have it. Just kind of eye-catching. Now let's talk about the Odyssey, the Enterprise F. The original version, Eaglemoss, it was a bonus edition. This actually came out before the Star Trek Online collection, and they had two paint schemes, more of a traditional and more of a Star Trek Online livery. And that, of course, led to the actual Star Trek Online series, and when they did that, they did the refit variant, the Yorktown style. Now, these were not officially canon until Picard Season 3. Now, the version actually seen in Season 3 of Picard is similar to these, more like the refit, but, you know, it's a live model. Well, it's just CGI, so yeah. But it's a little bit altered, but it's very recognizable as the Odyssey. Again, here's the original we looked at it in the previous video. And the refit, well, the differences are subtle, but there. This was, I think, issue 15 in the online collection, and since I already had the original, I wasn't sure if I'd get this, but I found it on sale back when Eaglemoss was still going. Biggest thing, we've got some speed fins on the wings. This is different here. We've got a little additional impulse manifolds, And the deflector dish has been kind of reshaped a bit. These are neat. The Odyssey's not my favorite design. In some ways, I think it's too conventional. It really resembles a Sovereign, just larger and with more of a galaxy-style deflector. To me, it doesn't have its own unique flavor, but then again, it's a video game. They probably didn't want to go too far off the norm, so there would be a quote-unquote Enterprise in the fleet. But yeah, Eaglemoss gave us a total of 2 molds and a few different paint jobs. And this is probably the ship that started the Star Trek Online collection when they did this as a bonus in the regular series, and it sold well enough they decided, heck, why not do it? A couple here. The warship Voyager from the episode Living Witness, essentially the mirror universe Voyager that we never got. Why would you not get this? It's hilarious. Giant cannon on the back, these cannon on the front, torpedo launchers, reshaped hull. And a good episode that really talks about history and politics and how that all kind of bleeds together. The underside is much more conventional, but that's not Eaglemoss being lazy. That's how it was in the show, and it was said that they recovered a partial schematic of Voyager. They probably only had the bottom, and so they assumed the top. It's just neat, a fun design. And if you remember in the last video, I talked about the Intrepid stand improving, whereas the previous Intrepids clipped onto the far back to try to hide the stand but left it a little unstable. Newer variants like this and the Borgified one have a more traditional saucer clip, but that's a good thing. Doesn't really fit anywhere else. I just thought I'd throw it in the video for fun. I did this a couple times here. And then of course we have this. The Galaxy X, the Dreadnought from All Good Things. Well, okay, this is actually the ISS variant, but it's the same mold, different paint scheme. It's just what I happen to get. They did an actual All Good Things, but it was a subscriber gift, and then you could get it later. But I already had this, and it's good enough. Mirror Universe version. You see the big phaser lance. The speed fins on the bottom of the hull. Fun fact, when they dressed up the Galaxy model for All Good Things, and then they stripped it down for reusing it in DS9, one element they left were these phaser strips on the nacelles. A few other small changes remained, but of course they took the extra nacelle off the top. I kind of like the extra bolt behind the bridge here. It's kind of neat. There's arguments whether these are cannons or sensors, but given the notion of the ship and this giant phaser cannon on the underside, I think turreted pulse phasers fit, especially if you want to just talk about the ISS version here. No, I really like this ship for what it is. I mean, I don't necessarily like the 3 nacelle design. I don't hate it, but Eaglemoss did a good job. There's just lots going on here, and they took the time to add this on and do that. And again, they were still working with a real miniature with All Good Things, and they didn't want to permanently alter the extremely valuable Enterprise D model, so they had to do changes that could easily be removed. But of course, when they tried that again with the Excelsior, when making the Enterprise B, just a year later, things didn't go so smoothly for them. Oh well. Good fun. Such an iconic ship in the final episode, and one of the best episodes of TNG. You gotta have something to represent it. And who's to say that some surviving galaxies weren't turned into dreadnoughts in the 2390s? So there's my headcanon, so I can have this ship in, because I like 3 and 4 nacelle vessels. So now let's get into the Star Trek Online proper. And really have to begin with issue 2, the Chimera Captain Nog's ship. This became popular because it was Nog's ship, and people like the design. It was also very early in the game. It's one of the original styles. And I do like the interesting deflector. It does seem kind of like the Dauntless style, so quantum slipstream. And finally, we don't have a overly exposed bridge. It seems pretty armored up. And we have an interesting quad nacelle system here. Very compacted together. Very streamlined hull. I really like how the pylons are horizontal. Not my absolute favorite, but I like it. It's unique enough. As we're about to discover, a lot of the Star Trek Online ships are just updates or kind of reimaginings of existing classes and designs, but here we actually have them doing something unique. And it kind of does establish a certain Star Trek Online 25th century design aesthetic, design look. Plus, I mean, always nice whenever there's extra content with Aaron Eisenberg. And as you see, it's a good size. This is all metal. The nacelles are thing. Yeah, I guess this is only issue 2, like I said, in the collection. But it's one that everyone wanted him to do. The only thing I'll gripe, and we'll see this with a lot of these, for whatever reason, most all the Star Trek Online stands fit loose. I'm not sure what the reasoning is. They're enough to hold them. They're not going to fall off on their own, but yeah. With that, let's talk about issue 3. Like I said, variations on a class. The Andromeda here. Very much a galaxy. Not a whole lot of change if you think about it. Still the same type of deflector. I mean, it's different, but very similar. Saucer. I do like this, how it's very straight and the back of here. Just straight slope, straight slide down. Neat lines. And of course the newer nacelles, the kind of squared off style. I like them. They'll end up fitting in well with some of the other Star Trek Online vessels. This is all metal here. The nacelles, as you see, because they're so thin, they're kind of wiggly, but they're not loose, they're just thin plastic. But they're also better to have thin plastic that can wiggle than thin plastic that's rigid and will break. But this is really the plastic. Once you start the spine, it's metal. It's a plastic, metal. It's good to see an updated galaxy. One thing I wish, and it's not a big deal, but I would have liked to have seen a Dominion War Galaxy variant or refit. Again, it's a lot like the Galaxy X, just with not as many bobs on. This one actually fits on its stand a little better than some of the others too. But it hangs off the back a long way. It kind of fits oddly. It fits further back and angle back. It's almost like the stand should have been more in the middle, but it does its job, right? And then we have another tribute over here. The Avenger is very much based on the Inquiry class, which is already a bit of a warship. But we have this interesting cutout in the back. And we don't have the big grill. It's been kind of changed a bit. It is different, but you can really see it in the pylons, the sweeping forward. I'm okay with it. It doesn't at all look like it, but for some reason it reminds me of the Nova class. Now, on the model, this is odd for Eaglemoss. It has a plastic saucer. The metal is actually a star drive. That's strange. If anything, it's usually reverse. That also means it's kind of light. This is one of their lighter Star Trek Online vessels. I'm going to be honest, it's one of my lesser favorites of the Starfleets. I don't hate it, but there's so many cooler designs. I don't know, there's something missing about both the design and the model, if that makes sense. I'm glad to have it, but yeah, has a little bit of that just there vibe, if that makes sense. The Chimera was issue 2, next to the first, obviously. Here, the Concorde was issue 20, the final one that they did. And this is a unique design, and the nacelles are really interesting. It definitely reminds me of an Excelsior. Not a take on it. It's not close enough to an Excelsior. It seems like it's a, reinventing. But the large neck, the small deflector in there, the large star drive, very Excelsior-esque. But it's different enough. I'm not going to say they copied an Excelsior. I'm going to say it's its own thing. And yeah, I like this design. And this model is a good size. We're back to a metal saucer, but only this part of the star drive is metal. Once you get down to here, it's plastic, so it's not the heaviest either, but I felt lighter. I'm trying to think if that's metal there. I think it is partially, and then it turns to plastic. Yeah, a little thing down there. It's got a lot going on. It definitely looks like a command ship. I think it's just described as an engineering cruiser. And I believe it. This looks like a support ship. Looks like it'd have a buttload of worker bees. And while I don't think it's the absolute best in the collection, I'll mention what I think that is in a minute, I don't think this was a bad one to end the series on. This was one of the big cruisers in Star Trek Online. And they were smart to do a majority of the Star Trek Online series as Federation ships, because that's what people wanted. But I'm also glad they gave us a couple of Romulans, a few Klingons, even a Dominion. I'm really actually happy with the Vanguard carrier from Dominion. Heck, we even got a Tholian, which is kind of cool. Yeah, I don't have a lot to say about this. I really like it, but it doesn't stand out. It's very conventional Starfleet design, but that's okay. It fits in, and it's unique enough. So, good on them. What to do next? Okay, why don't we talk Disco variants, Discovery variants in Star Trek Online, or rather their 25th century reimaginings here. And while they pretty much reimagined all the Discovery ships, it's interesting that Eaglemoss decided to do not one but 2 quad nacelles. But I'm not complaining. As I've said, I like quad nacelles. Well, let's begin with this one. Based on the McGee, the Shran Pilot Escort, really fits in well to my mind with the Defiant and other designs with compacted nacelles. And then a saucer built in and a bridge dome. I like the McGee, and I really like this one even more. And, the McGee is a little small in the Discovery Collection, but it's all metal. This one is the Star Trek Online, so it's a little big, and it's also all metal. So my point is, there's not a lot of size difference when you compare them, even though this is a standard, and that's considered a medium scale, a special scale. But it's a chunky ship, and I like it. This seems like an escort ship, almost fighter-sized, and I'm there for it. I actually like these kind of... What are those? Interesting saucer, edge, and contour. And I really like the front to the Bassard collectors. Is it practical to have nacelles running through your saucer so that you've got to somehow go through? No, of course not, but I don't care. This is Star Trek. Little shuttle bay back there, bridge dome. Plus, hey, it's named after Jeffrey Combs' character. How can you not love that? But this was definitely a hit, and I think it's one of the more popular Star Trek Online ships that Eaglemoss gave us. and they did a good job. What do you think? Do you think this sounds cool like me, or do you hate it? I know a lot of people do hate the McGee and Shran styles, but hey, different strokes, right? And it's definitely a unique silhouette, but this is where they do start kind of putting disco ships in the series. And now for our two quaddies. This is another one that actually fits its stand pretty well, at least compared to the others. And this is one of the times when I think the reimagining outstrips the original. I don't hate the Nimitz class, the USS Europa, the original, but it's not my favorite. However, this reimagining, the way they lengthen the nacelles and whatnot, I really like. Also, they gave it this small... Did I have that upside down? I might have done. Either way, it's space. You feel me? Sorry. It probably came off the stand, then I flipped it around at some point. These two come off. But no, I like the weapons bar, the roll bar. It does have a more exposed bridge. The original one did not. We have a cutout in the front for a deflector. I actually like the staggered nacelles, how they're slightly offset to each other. Very noticeable impulse manifolds in the back. Now this one I really like. Is a quad nacelle, and it's a good ship from Eaglemoss. Metal saucer, plastic nacelles, so it's got some heft to it. I'm sure it goes back on the stand this way. Yeah, sometimes with these, yeah, I was thinking it fit on it stand a little loose. I think it was just tight because it flipped around. Yeah, see, this one is another loose one. And when I picked it up, I was like, why is it fitting tighter than usual? Again, it doesn't come off on its own, but it's just something with those Star Trek Onlines. Now with the Buran, it's kind of the opposite. I do like the 25th century version here, but I think the 23rd century version, Lorca's ship, is just a little bit cooler. But that's not to say this one's bad. The kind of axe head style saucer, metal all the way back till you get to these. Now these nacelles are lined up with each other and kind of splayed out in an X-wing pattern. Little deflector down here. I do like it, but I think it's just because the original Discovery model is one of their best efforts. It's just very impressive. It's, I think, the largest one in the Disco collection. It's got a tough act to follow, but I will say this is a large one too. Really showing how big the Onlines can get. So it's neat that they did these. But I've left out a couple of Star Trek Online ships for a reason. Some of you, I'm sure, have guessed it. Others, well, this is why I split them up. The Gagarin, the Edison, and the Pathfinder. All from Star Trek Online, and originally in the collection. But now, well, they're a little special, because these are officially canon thanks to Star Trek Picard. So let's go to the Gagarin, which was actually issue 1 in the Star Trek Online. And it's an interesting place to start. This was based on the Shepherd class from Discovery. But it's been majorly updated, especially with the nacelles. And I will say, these forked nacelles in the back, this is fine detailing back here. Because they could have very easily just made this one piece, but it's actually two. And the Bassard collectors are interesting style. Now, I like this ship. It's quite long, but very flat. But this was one of the first Star Trek Online ships to become canon when it was seen in the fleet in Season 2, in the first and the last episode. Now, there were others. I believe the Ross class was one, but unfortunately Eaglemoss was not able to give us a Ross class. But we did get the Gagarin. And now that this is officially a canon ship, pretty much lifted directly from Star Trek Online and just slightly updated for the live action show, this has become quite in demand by a lot of people, especially not knowing if any more will ever be done. So I'm actually very happy to have it, and I think it fits in very well with the fleet. I think it's one of the cooler and more unique offerings. But these other two are no slouch either. The Edison class is based on the original Hoover class, and is kind of in that same vein as a Miranda or a Nebula or the Centaur. Actually, I guess at the most it reminds me of the Centaur. Very flat, squashed in nacelles, very squashed in drive section. But you know what? It could be bad, but it works for this. And I actually like the back of the saucer, how it extends out a bit, but then has this cutout for either an impulse. I think it's a shuttleway. I think the impulse will be here. Now, this one was not made canon in Star Trek Picard Season 2. This would actually be made canon in Season 3 towards the end as part of the big fleet. Another online ship that was made canon was the Reliant class, but as with the Ross, we just don't have it in the online collection. Maybe one day someone will give it to us when we pick it up. Cool design. I don't quite like it as much as the Gagarin, but I think it's a good solid ship of the fleet, you know what I mean? But our third and final one here is actually my favorite of all of them. The Intrepid variant Pathfinder. And this is my favorite because it kind of ticks all the boxes. Now, this is not one I got from Eaglemoss. They were sold out. These, even before they went out of business, sold out quickly. So I had to go elsewhere. I can't remember if I bought it on Amazon or I didn't have to pay a whole lot for it, but I did have to search for it. And I'm glad I did. For one thing, I do like the Intrepid look. By the way, the name Pathfinder, ironically, at one time was applied to the concept Defiant, that would become the Nova class. I like the Dauntless style deflector and underslung nacelles. I really actually like the sweep of these nacelles, kind of extended out from what Voyager had. Blinds of the ship I really like. But what's neat about this, it's a good size, but this is one of the most metal vessels in the collection. Metal. And it's one of the few that actually has metal nacelles. There's only... well, I thought there was some plastic somewhere. I'm sure there is somewhere. Maybe. This might be all metal. It's certainly the heaviest. This is a heavy guy. And I like that. I think someone else was a big fan of this design too and really gave it their all. I even like how they kind of changed the secondary deflector and give it this big old cutout. No, this is my favorite. Both in terms of the Star Trek Online design and in terms of the model itself. And now, because again Picard Season 3 showed this off, this is officially a canon ship. So that's why it's my favorite. It hit all the right marks. With, I'm going to be honest, probably the Gagarin being runner-up. Interesting Star Trek Online fleet. What do you think of these designs? Some of them do come across as a little video gamey, but that's not a bad thing. While others, as you saw, fit right into the live action show. And with that, we leave the 25th century and go to the future, and we go back to the standard collection for the Enterprise J. This had to have been a challenging one for them to put into diecast. While today we do see this in Star Trek Online, for years, all we knew about this was that one episode with Daniels in Season 3 of Star Trek Enterprise. And while they were on board the Enterprise J in like an observation area, the only thing we knew about the ship was an orthographics display, a little LCARS display on the screen that just showed a top-down view. So we knew nothing about it. They were trying to make it look like the NX, but, futuristic. In fact, the class name for a while was speculated to maybe be Monarch class, like Sovereign class, well, Monarch class. But eventually, Universe was settled upon and more lore was given to it, including the partial organics and the fact that it was giant. This is definitely our widest saucer ever. Well, look how thin that is. That is some impressive die casting. And look at these things. These nacelles are actually taken from the Voyager concept we looked at last time, the Altair. There's a variant of this called the Congo. This is metal, all metal here. This is metal, and then you get to the struts, the pylons, and that's plastic. So it's actually quite heavy, even though it's so very thin, and it's in the front. I bought this one years ago in the collection just out of curiosity when it was on sale. It's really funny how a ship that was literally just like a nearly black and white wireframe on a screen, briefly seen during a 30-second conversation, eventually was actualized into a fully rendered, fully functional ship. 3D here, and in Star Trek Online. This is definitely one of those love it or hate it ships. But I like the lore surrounding it. And I do actually like the deflector in the front. Very NX style. Just know that, if you get one of these, be very careful with it. It would be so easy to snap off the end of your nacelle or your entire nacelle in general. One saving grace, it does hook onto its stand, and it's kind of kept on there by the nacelles, the struts, the pylons very well. I'm not saying it can't fall off, but it's pretty good on there. Our next one isn't, though. The Wells class, the Relativity, is one of the few that does just seem to jump off its stand. But luckily, there's not much to break on it. And trust me, when I got this in, I was like, what the shit? I identify this as a Federation Starfleet ship. This is, of course, from Voyager, the episode, Relativity. It does seem a little like a Defiant, but in other ways, it's very, very alien. The drive section in the rear here is obviously a different type of propulsion. It's said that all these spikes and things are to make it go through time better. Sure, okay. What is it, like the aerial rule of that? That's it. I'm glad they did it, and they did a good job. It's all metal. The bottom here, this is plastic. I guess you call this the deflector. Or maybe that's the deflector. I never could decide. Is that the deflector or is that the deflector? Anyway, that's plastic, but everything else, metal. Which is one of the reasons it likes to slip on off its stand more, because it is heavy. I thought about bringing the Aeon out, the Eon, but that's a shuttle. No matter how I twisted it in my head, I couldn't justify it as a full starship, and I'm not doing shuttles in this video. I like it. It's different. And that can be said for our next ones too. So it's time to wrap up with the 32nd century disco ships. So, yeah, when we see Starfleet in the 32nd century, season 3 of Discovery, I bet Eaglemoss was on the one hand very happy. Here's a whole bunch of ships we can do. On the other hand, how the crap are we going to do detached nacelles and star drives and all that stuff? I know a lot of people wondered too. So the first one they attempted was the cross-filled, the Discovery A. And what they basically did was you have clear clips holding the nacelles on, the same plastic used for the stand. Is this ideal? Of course not. But I can't think of a better way. And it is secure. And the clips are as small as you could really make them without making them fragile. Keep in mind these are meant to be durable models, not only sit on the shelf. No, it's fine. I don't know how they could have done it but better. And if someone wanted, these are perfectly detachable. They're not attached to the clear clips. The clips come off both. So if you have a better idea, do it. You've got the nacelles, you've got the thing. In fact, this is even metal. So if you could, well, I was going to say if you rigged out something magnetic, but the thing, if you tried a magnet, it would just go towards them. It wouldn't be separated. Again, aside from just like maybe putting it on a like a background and gluing, I don't know how she'd do it. Anyway, I think they did a perfectly good job, and this was their first effort. And they recast the entire Discovery. It's a different size. I do like the somewhat shorter nacelles. I definitely like the newer deflector. Plot points aside, just talking about the ship design and the detached nacelle system, this was an interesting new direction for Eaglemoss. And these, of course, would be in the medium scale, the special scale. This is metal. The saucer is mostly plastic except for the back piece. But that makes sense considering this. And, of course, one thing, too, they had to manage was on the saucer, the support struts are gone. On the original version, there were little spines there, but here they had to only use that back piece to connect them. So I could imagine this being an engineering challenge, but given that, I think they did a really good job. They also did an XL version, but I thought this was plenty big, so never had a whole lot of interest in the XLs. So with the A out, and we saw how they did that, we knew it'd just be a matter of time before we got the rest of the Starfleet, detached nacelles and all. The Voyager J is easily my favorite, and I think a lot of people would agree. And this one I have a fond memory of. I didn't get a ship notice from me. This is towards the end. I made a video when it happened. I didn't get a ship notice, no big deal. And then my wife said a package came. So I wasn't expecting it, opened it up, and it was this one and the next one in the series, as well as the last two in the Battlestar Galactica series. So 4 ships that I didn't know even on the way just showed up at my door, and they were all ones that I was anticipating. So that was a great surprise. So that already put me in a good mood. And the Voyager J, I think they did a good job. They hid the connector as best they could, especially from the top. If you flip it over, it's more visible on the bottom, but it fits well. This is a separate piece, one big piece that holds these two together. And of course the nacelles aren't fixed in there, they pop out. So again, if you've got a better way. Another thing they did, the Voyager J also had a detached star drive, and if you can see in there, this is detached. They use small clear pins to hold them together. Now these come assembled. I mean, I'm sure you could break it apart, but it's very stable. So I think they did a pretty good job with that little engineering challenge. Kind of funny, it has this kind of cutout loop in the back. I'm not sure what that's for at that point. Oh well, kind of looks neat. And then we kind of see the new bridge aesthetic here that we'll see in other ships, with this kind of raised area and flat front. It's very identifiable as a Starfleet ship, but also not something you're going to mistake for the original Voyager. And it's a really good size too, and it's metal. And then the star drive's plastic is in, it's a separate piece, so metal saucer diamond. It's not even really a saucer anymore. And then a plastic star drive. Interesting, very streamlined deflector too. And it's not just the Voyager we see. We see 3 or 4 of these destroyed in the burn, and then we see at least 4 in the surviving Starfleet. Yeah, this is really neat work. And it sits on a stand very well, like the standard Intrepids. It just clips onto the back of the saucer/diamond, and because of the weight distribution, it doesn't slip off at all. I've never had this even try to walk off the stand, and I've never had the nacelles really fall off either. And I've had this for a couple of years. So the first 2 32nd century ships, I think they did about as good as they could, especially on a budget. You know, yeah, if you've got a multi-$100 model, you could probably do a little better. But for what, $40 I paid for these, I sure couldn't do any better. But let's see how they ended the collection. Well, the Voyager J kind of more or less looked like how I envisioned it in my mind's eye, as did the Discovery A. This one didn't. The USS Nog, the Eisenberg class. This is an odd duck. And this is the first one we see with the detached nacelles mounted to the clear display stand and not directly to the ship. Because when you pick it up, it comes out. Again, I don't know how else they could have really done it, unless they put holes in the side to stick them in. This had to have been a bit of a challenge, but they had to do it for Aaron Eisenberg. The whole thing's a tribute to him and Nog. But boy, is it weird. Weird's not bad. Weird's just weird. This really actually kind of matches better with the Relativity, the Wells class. The kind of sharper edges and angles and stuff. Little fin on the back. At first I wasn't sure what to think about it, because I was expecting a more conventional Starfleet ship, but we do see quite a few vertically oriented ships in this fleet. Yeah, it's grown on me. Plastic on top, metal on the bottom. In fact, that's even metal. And it's actually really good that it is, because it keeps it from being top heavy. It already kind of sits strange in this pocket. If you don't get it right, it wants to tip back. But if you can kind of finagle it, there's a spot where it kind of clicks in. You hear it? And when it's in that spot, it's good. That's the positive. But these nacelles, that's a negative. This is my first kind of real complaint with the way Eaglemoss did this. They just sit there in these little cradles. And they're plastic. And so they have no weight to them. I think if they were metal, they'd at least have some weight keeping them down. But they don't. They come off at the slightest breeze. Now, maybe I've got them on wrong, but I've tried fitting them every which way to Sunday, and this is the way they seem to want to fit the best. And I've asked people online. Again, if you're just sitting on the shelf, they fit. They're not, the clips are very much sized for them, but there's nothing holding them in. There's no tension. So what I ended up doing was taking a small piece of blue tack in the front and back, 2 little blobs, and just blue tacking them in. And that's fine. I would suggest you do the same or figure out some other way, because if you just leave them like this, you're going to lose them. On the shelf, they might fall down, then the cat or dog gets them, and then they're gone. And that would just kind of wreck your model. So if you get one of these, which I'm not saying you shouldn't, I think it's a very unique design, and be mindful of your nacelles, because you don't want to lose them. They look dorky. And this ship is already odd enough as it is. Yeah, when I first got it, I was a little but it really has grown on me. It's never going to be my favorite, but I like the difference. I think it does kind of mesh in well with the wells, like I said. But what do you think? Maybe it's horrible to you. And if I do have the nacelles wrong, please do let me know. I didn't glue them. I just like a little blue tack. Blue tack is our friend. So those two came in together, the Voyager J and the USS Nog. And I can't remember in the series which one was technically first. I think it was the Voyager J, but it might have been the Nog. And these came out when Eaglemoss was still going, and I don't think they'd even officially been closed yet. I think that was April or May, and then it was July when news came down of their bankruptcy. Right before that happens, I receive one more of these ships. The Mars class Scout light cruiser. Interesting design. Curving forward nacelles. We don't have many nacelles like this, which does give it kind of a fast look. Now, some have speculated this might be one of the few ship classes made after the burn, but when I did my canon here, I just decided to go ahead and include it with the pre-ship. It is smaller than the ones we've looked at, but then again, that's what it's supposed to be. And again, the nacelles are actually on the stand directly. And this is interesting. Instead of being cradled in or clipped on, they actually put a slot in the side of the nacelle. And so they plug into the stand. There's pros and cons to that. I mean, they really try to avoid putting holes in things. But if they put a clip around it, would have had to have been very big. Maybe it was just too ugly. I do think these nacelles are quite an interesting design. But what do you think? This is one too that I was a little at a loss as to how exactly it went together. Yeah, sometimes not seeing pictures stinks. I wasn't even 100% sure which way this diamond fit in. Very plain Jane hull. Very UFO-like if you think about it. It's got a little bit of stuff going on the underside. I would imagine that was connective hardware for the nacelles. Little dot here in the middle. And on top, assuming they're signal lights, because we see on the sides here. Again, I may have the directions wrong, but easy enough to flip it around, right? Thing is, when I put it like this side up, it sure fits just wrong with a lot of dead air. See? Flip it over. Try putting it this way. And it's better. But then I do it this way. It's the best fit, especially vertically. It kind of makes sense that the little kind of greeblies in the front would interface where the edges of the nacelles come. But please let me know if I'm wrong. This is a design that is pretty unique. Unfortunately, we don't know much about the 32nd century ships, even now, even years after Disco seasons 3 and 4. Crews, we don't even really see inside them much. But what's new? So this was the last one of these I received directly from Eaglemoss, and the last one they released in their collection. But a few months back, Master Replicas made an announcement. There was one that was scheduled to be produced, and they'd already made prints of the model, but not of the book. So we ended up getting one more. Now, as I said, there were a lot of ships seen in the Starfleet. And if you said, okay, you only get one more, I would have picked the future Constitution. But they went with the Courage. And I will say, if they wanted to pick something unique and identifiable, well, they found one. Two things are pretty immediately apparent. For one, this is a vertically oriented ship, for the most part. And for another, this is the only one not featuring detached nacelles. In fact, unless those are nacelles, which I'm pretty sure they're not at the bottom, this doesn't really have nacelles at all. You got these things, these struts. Yeah. I'd love to hear what this is supposed to be. Because it looks like it was built for a purpose. As I said earlier, I could see it either as a command ship or a big passenger ship. It looks like it's got a lot of room on it. I mean, it's probably in volume terms the biggest one we've got. And it definitely resembles the rest, kind of a diamond shape hull. But then we have this very, like an egg-shaped hull here. And here this down section with these struts. It's interesting. Definitely kind of keeps on with the hollow aesthetic. And again, you got these two little things down here. Not entirely sure what those are. I'm not sure they were sure either. Looks like they could be anything. Unique design though. It's relatively light, but also very large. Metal, plastic underneath. So the metal is the top part. Not light. I mean, it's not feather light, but it's maybe slightly lighter than you would think. I wonder if that slit's supposed to be a deflector. Shoot, one could even argue which direction is forward with this guy. I mean, you could argue this, but I'm quite sure this is supposed to be the front. But I could be wrong. Let me know. Maybe they don't know. Maybe it goes both ways. They certainly picked an interesting one. I have a feeling that Eaglemoss was planning before their demise to do all of them eventually. I would have bought them. Again, these weren't massively expensive, especially if you bought them with a coupon, on sale, something like that. Usually $40, give or take, sometimes cheaper. Even if you had to pay full price, they were only like $54, so. And they only came out about every other month. But they're unique. I mean, I can't imagine any other company doing the ships from Discovery. It seems like whenever a new company gets into the game doing Star Trek ships, they kind of do the old favorites, the tried and true, the greatest hits. They rarely do the background things, which is really what I appreciated about Eaglemoss's collection from the very beginning. Sure, they had to do the favorites, always. But from the beginning, they really went out of their way to do background and fan favorite ships, like the Nova, and even the Rhode Island. See, this actually sits on its stand quite well, and it actually has those little forks stick out the bottom to center it. This had to have been a real fun one to design the stand for, too. They probably halfway wanted to resort to pegs and just putting a hole in it, but I'm kind of glad they didn't. It's such a smooth, sleek hull that it would have been a shame to break that up. And even though I wouldn't have picked this as my final ship, if you ask me, they could have done a lot worse. At least they picked something unique. And even if we didn't get the entire Starfleet, shoot, a total of 5 is not bad at all. Not at all. And maybe one day another company will pick up. And if they do, there is one for an nacelle design I'd like to see, and or the Constitution of the future. Those would be my next picks. There's others. There's even the grain ship, which would be kind of cool because it was a bit of a plot point. But in the end, I'm just grateful what we got, and I'm also grateful to Discovery for giving us new ship classes. I like ships. Maybe we'll get some future Klingon ships or Romulan/Vulcan ships. Ooh, that'd be neat to see a 32nd century ring ship melded with a bird of prey or a warbird. Anyway, I've been doing this long enough. You got my opinion. Let me hear yours. And let's wrap it up. Alright. I knew this, looking at the Starfleet ships, would be an undertaking, but it's done. I'd like to know which of the eras is your favorite. The pre-Federation, the first century of the Federation, the Golden Era, the Borg and Dominion War era, or maybe even this era, the Star Trek Online and the Discovery future period. Let me know. You've heard my thoughts, so I'd really like to hear yours. As always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. Please do comment. Just doing this for fun. Appreciate you tuning in. And this is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.